right, hello everyone, and welcome to Get Geeked, presented by Barnes and Noble. I am here with Josh Trujillo. Josh, thank you so much for being here today.
No, of course. Thank you for having me.
So Josh is a writer, editor, and narrative designer based in Los Angeles. He has worked with clients including Marvel, Gearbox, Telltale Games, Netflix, and DC Comics, among others. And one such other is Miraculous Ladybug, which is what we're here to talk about today. But before we get into Miraculous Ladybug, Josh, I want to ask sort of what are your earliest memories of getting into a geekdom or a fandom, sort of that first story universe that pulled you in?
Yeah, I was thinking about this recently in watching Wicked. When I was a little kid, Wizard of Oz was a big deal. It was on the TV once a year and it was a big event. And so I remember like always like begging my mom so I could stay up late and watch it on TV. And like there are so many books and like just a huge world. And I think that was my first entry point in realizing that like sometimes it's more than a story, sometimes it's an entire universe.
Mhm.
And so later getting into like Star Wars or Star Trek, Pokemon, whatever it is, it kind of all started when I was like probably 3 or 4.
And what was it that pulled you in? Was it, like you said, just that this universe existed and being a part of it, or what drew you in and what helped you stay in these universes?
Oh gosh, I think, having a well-defined universe that kind of stands apart from what else is out there, I think really helps is having engaging characters and just having like a visual style that is really attractive and appealing to you. Obviously, like for Oz, they're novels. So you kind of have to do with the theater of the mind. But even then, you get kind of like a sense of what everything looks like and what it feels like.
Mhm. And when did that sort of engagement with those storytelling universes merge into your own creative pursuit? Like you've done a lot of writing. Your resume sparkles with all these wonderful properties you've worked with. So when did you start combining those two as a writer with the IPs that you were already interested in?
Oh gosh, probably, honestly, probably 3 or 4. I remember when I was a kid, I would, draw whatever characters I liked, like Scarecrow or Superman or whoever, and I'd like try to tell, I guess I'd call them early comics, right? It'd just be a single drawing, and then I'd have my mom write down the words for what they would be saying because I couldn't write then. And then later, I would trace over Garfield comic scripts and I would rearrange the panels and make my own comics. And so, like, really from a very early age, I was always kind of like mimicking some of my favorite stories.
I love that. So it's literally been your whole life you've been doing this. That's so cool. So you mentioned a lot of the properties that got you interested as both a creative and as a consumer, but were there any that really stood out, like particular fandoms or universes that have just stuck with you throughout time?
Oh gosh, I mean, Star Wars is one of those things that's kind of followed me through my whole life. I think that's one in particular. Or whenever the new Pokemon game drops, it's usually every other year or something. I completely go back into that world like I'm in seventh grade. So it's kind of those that kind of follow me, but some come and go. Like I wasn't reading Oz books or anything probably in the past 10 years, but then the Wicked movie came out and it kind of like reignited. I'm like, oh yeah, I used to be really into this. There's all this stuff that I remember that I just haven't accessed in a while, but it never goes away.
I feel you on that one. It's such a good feeling whenever like a new Star Wars, even with all the criticism of it, like anytime you enter Star Wars, it's like there's this feeling of like, oh, I'm here. I'm back in the universe again, and that's just such a cool feeling.
Yeah, definitely the familiarity of it and being able to revisit things kind of from a different angle at different points in your life is so compelling.
Definitely, yeah. So let's get into Miraculous Ladybug. So you wrote three of the four, and I'm assuming more because this is an ongoing series
Hmm.
of the Miraculous Ladybug Chibi graphic novels. So can you tell us a bit about, before we get into this specific project, what your connection is to Miraculous Ladybug? Was this something that you had already encountered, or was this a new universe for you?
Yeah, so I don't have any little ones in my life, unfortunately, but I've seen the characters everywhere. It's one of those things where you don't realize how popular some of these characters are because you're not of that age range, right? But my friends do have some kids, and so I did ask them about this, about these characters, and there's like, Josh, you've never heard of them? Like, are you insane? And so so I was approached to do the books. I was very excited about that. I knew they were kind of popular, but then I go on YouTube, these things have billions and billions of views. These are some of the most popular children's characters like in the world. And so I realized that like, oh, I have to get this right because there's 500 million children ready to snap it up.
Hmm. So what was that research process like? Did you watch the shows? How did you get into that universe?
Yeah, I just kind of started downloading as many videos into my brain as I possibly could. I the cartoons are so compelling, they're like well-defined characters and they're really easy to understand, especially in these chibi ones, which I thought was a really fun take on the characters. Because sometimes, adapting them to different styles or different age ranges, you never know how it's going to end up. But I thought this was a really smart way to kind of capture the essence of the characters for younger readers.
Was there anything in particular in meeting this universe? I mean, you mentioned the characters, which I agree. I think they're the way they define their different characters is so strong. But was there anything in this universe that really sort of pulled you in and made you realize this was like a really good place to be?
Oh gosh, I love the trappings of the superhero that they kind of like dabble in. Obviously, I've written a lot of superhero comics myself, so that was something I could immediately latch on to. And it's kind of that wish fulfillment, that fantasy, right? Of being a superhero, running along the rooftops, getting into fun adventures with your best friend. Like that was fun for me.
Mhm. So speaking of the chibi graphic novels in particular, how did you get, like you said, you were approached to write these? How did this all come about, and what were your initial thoughts whenever you got approached to do this?
Yeah, so I was asked by my editors to be a part of this, and I immediately jumped at the chance. It seemed really, really fun, and I love trying to test out as many different worlds as I can. But the early conversations were just kind of like I was surprised by how easygoing everyone was and how excited they were to have me be a part of it. And there was no, it was very much like improv, right? It was yes and to everything. There was no idea where they're like, that's too silly. Like that doesn't happen here. This is silly is good. Silly is what we're trading in here.
Yeah, silly is like reading this first volume. I was like, oh my gosh, like this whole thing was just them trying to track down a pizza. Like it was so satisfying though. So they were so much fun. Before we go specifically in there, how would you describe these to fans that are already acquainted with Ladybug? Like, what do these chibi graphic novels offer that isn't already there?
Yeah, I'd say these are kind of small slices of adventure and humor. And if you're just looking for kind of like a nice laugh, something that's comfortable, something that you can see a different side of Ladybug and Cat Noir, I think this is a great way to get into that. Or if you're like maybe an older kid and you have a little brother or sister who, maybe can't read the full comics, this is a great way for them to kind of get into comics as well and also learn more about the characters.
And was there anything in particular, because you mentioned that these meetings were always, yes, and there's nothing too silly. Was there anything in particular you wanted to bring to this universe?
Oh gosh. No, I wanted to capture the goofiness. I thought everything was so well established. And sometimes you write for these worlds and you kind of have to fill in the blanks. But for this, it just seemed everything came very easily. And it's all broad and big exaggerated expressions and big emotions and big adventure.
So was this a situation where like they told you, hey, we want you to do these stories. Now you tell us what the stories will be about. Did you have to like pitch the stories to them?
Yeah, some of the stories are very closely inspired by these chibi shorts that are online,
Mhm.
and others are original stories. So it was a combination of the two that they were kind of looking for. And so coming up with the original stories was interesting because a lot of these are basically like a lot of chases, right? They're running after each other, they're trying to get the pizza, they're trying to run away from the cats, whatever it is. And so you know, as long as we were keeping the energy up and keeping the excitement going, they were game for anything.
I want to ask about the actual writing process of this because one of the things I noticed in reading them was there's not a lot of talking. It really is a
Mhm.
lot of like internal dialogue, the occasional like laugh or something. Does that present a challenge as a writer to have it primarily, especially scripting it out, like action based without a lot of dialogue?
Yes. It is a little tricky in terms of you want to write everything for the script as clearly as possible. And you want to make sure that nothing gets lost in the art because not only are these, silent comics, but there's the double complication of these being for younger readers. So you want to make sure everything is as clear as possible. I wrote a children's book a few years ago and I learned how complicated writing something simple is.
Mhm.
And that was a skill that I definitely transferred over to Ladybug and Cat Noir.
Mhm. So the stories that you wrote, they only involve Cat Noir and Ladybug. Was that something that were you excited to just focus on them two? Do you have a favorite character in this universe?
Oh gosh. I mean, right now it's Cat Noir, I think, for sure. But there's such an interesting expanded cast of characters. For these early stories, I wanted to focus on the main duo and make sure I got that dynamic right kind of before expanding to the wider universe.
And since you mentioned that, like I did allude to earlier, are you going to be writing additional stories within this series? And if so, what's the plan for that, if you can share?
Oh gosh, it's me and several talented writers who are kind of tag teaming on these stories. I believe I have stories in, I want to say volume three, uh, and then we're kind of discussing what could be possible after that. But I know they have a long line of these they want to make, and they want to keep fans excited, and because these are short, quick comics, and they're going to keep releasing them as long as people want them.
Mhm. Did you have like this is a very generic sounding question, but like a favorite part of writing into this universe? What was the most enjoyable part of writing these characters?
Oh gosh. I mean, the fun challenge, kind of going back to something earlier, was writing it with as little dialogue as possible to make it accessible, not just to young readers, but also international readers.
Mhm.
Because these characters have such a global appeal. I think that was some of the inspiration for kind of keeping it simple. They speak very rarely. They speak kind of sometimes in emoticons, basically,
Mhm.
emojis. I guess they don't call them emoticons anymore, but and then just honestly, just tapping into the colorful world of it and writing something for a younger reader audience is always really exciting for me. A lot of my stuff is kind of for not necessarily adults, but more like older teenagers, perhaps to young adults. And so, getting to do something for my friends' kids is always a huge thrill.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask about like you've written across so many different IPs for so many different audiences, from Borderlands to Rick and Morty, DC Marvel. Then you go to this, which is for a much younger audience. How do you compartmentalize your writing voice? Do you feel like you have different writing voices, or does it all just kind of come naturally?
Oh gosh, I feel like it kind of all comes from the same brain, which makes sense. But beyond that, it's just knowing to filter your writing and to not overcomplicate in this case. I want, like I said, I want kind of straightforward, understandable stories for anyone, for everyone, and that's kind of what my marching orders internally have been. But it's not that much different than writing for, say, a Rick and Morty or a Batman or whatever it is. You're still trying to tell a complete, coherent story, and honestly, sometimes coming up with these limitations to keep it young, to keep it with very little dialogue, that actually helps the writing process.
And I want to follow up on that. I'm fixated by this because I always remark how interesting it is to read a story with so little dialogue. I find that process fascinating. So was that something that was sort of mandated to you, or did you take that on yourself?
It was kind of an order that we wanted to have as little dialogue as possible. At one point, they were entirely silent, but I think that created some complications in itself. So now we use kind of the emojis or the shorthand reactions or small little bits of dialogue or text here and there. But I was really excited to do it. I write a lot of silent comics. It's a visual medium, so I always like to test myself and see how complicated a story I can tell with as little words as possible. And in this case, I just wanted to tell a fun story.
I love that. I love that. Um, and then with a lot of writing into IP, there are often like rules, like things that you're told, okay, just don't touch this, don't mess with this. Were you given any sort of, and you don't have to go into like anything you're not allowed to
Oh,
share,
sure.
but is there anything that you were like explicitly not allowed to do, or things that you or characters or places you weren't allowed to include?
No, not at all. I was waiting for an order to say no or whatever. Like they go to a cemetery at one point in one of the stories. So once they let me do that, I was like, oh, we're just having fun here. We can do whatever we want.
Right. Once you go to a cemetery, it's like all bets are off. We can do whatever we want. So I want to transition a little bit out of that and talk about, because as we mentioned, you've written across a lot of different IPs, Rick and Morty, Marvel, DC, all these different ones. Is it challenging stepping, you know, into a different universe? You know, you've already been in one, now you have to go into this other IP universe, or does that just become natural after a while?
It does kind of become secondhand nature after a while, but a while being, I've been writing professionally for about 10 years now. So it is a skill, it's a muscle you have to build up over time. And you really have to do your homework. It's not as easy as just kind of guessing what Sonic the Hedgehog or Ladybug are going to say. You really have to follow kind of what's been established beforehand and make sure you match those character voices because those fans will let you know immediately if you get something wrong.
Yes, they will. Yeah. Uh, so then along those lines, you know, bringing up characters and all the different characters that you've written into, I, I'm wondering if there was like one specific case that you could zoom in on how you prepare to write a character.
Oh gosh. Let's see. I'm trying to think of, I wrote the Blue Beetle character from DC Comics for a few years, and I loved Jaime. When I was a teenager, those books were still first coming out, and so I had to go back and I reread the original run of I think 36 issues, and then I read all the other comics that had come past. So I wanted to kind of create the ultimate story. That's what you always want to do, right? You want to make the most memorable, the best. But for this one, I really kind of wanted to learn not just about the character's history, all of his villains, but also, he's Mexican American and he has a strong culture that really is intrinsic to the character. And that's similar to my upbringing, but also I wanted to make sure I got it right and bigger and more authentic because my experience is not his. I grew up in Southern California, he grew up in Texas. And so that they might as well be a world away. So learning about those cultural differences was really interesting for me and a big part of the homework in writing that character. But other things, I wrote a Batman crossover where he teams up with an esports team, and that's a world I'm not familiar with, and so that required a lot of time asking my brother, asking my friends, like, can you teach me more about this world? Because I don't know competitive gaming like that. But again, that's the homework. It sounds like a complaint, but really I'm just asking my friends about how playing video games works for them. So I can't complain too much.
Right, not so bad. Have there been any characters or universes that have been more challenging to write into just because of either the homework involved or just because the voice didn't come naturally?
Hmm. I think a character that was kind of deceptively tricky to write was Sonic the Hedgehog.
Mhm.
Uh, and I love that character. I love Sonic, Tails, Knuckles. I grew up with the video games, and so that's kind of where my familiarity lies with the characters. But they have a rich universe way beyond that. If you've seen the Sonic movies, they kind of touch on some of these elements of the continuity they have. But there's this big, expansive Sonic world that, I didn't know about until I started to write the Sonic comics. And so it wasn't the Sonic that I grew up with that I was writing. I was writing the Sonic that was the comic book hero. And so trying to come up with what's the difference, splitting the difference with that characterization was a little tricky because they're both headstrong, confident, and heroic. But dealing with, not dealing with, but communicating with Sega in Japan, they have very strict ideas of what they want that character to be like. And so that required more notes and revisions than maybe I initially expected, but that's the job, You want to make sure that you're pleasing these companies that you get the opportunity to write their favorite characters for. So it's an honor to write Sonic, to write anyone, and I do it again, even if it took 10 more rounds of notes.
And then I want to flip that a little bit and ask if there were any characters that you wrote that were unexpected, that were even better than you expected them to be. Like maybe characters you didn't know as well, and then as you got to know them, they really started to take life.
Yeah, recently I wrote a Gambit comic where Gambit from the X-Men, he's the Cajun. And I had a lot of fun writing that kind of fake Cajun-ism dialogue. And that came surprisingly easy, I think because I grew up with that character in the comics and in the animated show that we all watched. And so, I loved that character, and it was amazing how quickly and naturally I found his voice.
I do want to ask about that because that Cajun voice is tricky. I'm rereading the X-Men manga now, and
Mhm.
anytime his voice comes in, like that would be a tremendous challenge to write. So did that come naturally? How did you go about getting that voice?
So I do have a couple friends who are from the New Orleans area, And so I did have them do a check and make sure I wasn't putting my foot in my mouth or making a parody of what that dialect sounded like. But Gambit's so over the top, and I think people love the silliness kind of his phrasings, or they like to have a little fun with his vocal affectations. So it was fun. It was a great I don't know, it was a great time.
Hmm. And you know, you obviously you've written original work as well, but I'm always curious the difference between creating something original and then creating within an IP universe. Do both
Mhm.
creative processes feel the same to you?
Oh gosh. You know, I could write a short outline for existing characters, and if I were to tell the same story with original characters, the outline would be 10 times as long. There there's shorthand to writing established characters that can make it easier at times. So for example, like Rick and Morty, we're in Rick's garage. I just have to write that in the script. The artist knows what Rick's garage looks like. We've seen it in the cartoon show a million times. But if I were to describe that original story, I need to know everything on in the tool shelf. I need to know where the car is parked. I need to know where the lighting is coming from. And these are all things that just add to the story. You have to layer all this texture, all this characterization and personality. So you get you get a couple cheats when you write existing characters because there are these known elements, these known locations, these known characters. But a lot of the fun of creating original worlds, is going back and forth with the artist and your team and trying to create something compelling, but also that stands apart from what else is out there.
Mhm. No, that makes a lot of sense. So we're just about out of time, but I want to get two more questions in. First off, but I want to end with something about Ladybug. But first off, I want to ask, I've said this a lot as I've talked to you, but you've written across a lot of IPs. But I'm curious if there are characters or universes you haven't written into yet that you would like to be a part of.
Oh gosh, my white whale, my dream project is to write a Star Wars anything. I'll write a coloring book if they let me. Um, I love those characters, and it just seems like such a bucket list item to get to write for some of these worlds and aliens, and just it just seems like such a fun playground.
Hmm. Is there a particular character or particular planet or alien? I'm a Star Wars fan. I have like an encyclopedia of Star Wars stuff here. So anything that you mention, I'll probably recognize. So I'm just curious if there are characters or planets or anything in particular that really calls out to you.
I think it shows when I grew up, but I love the prequels,
Hmm.
and so I
Makes
really
sense.
like Padme. I like Naboo, the Gungans, the Handmaidens. I would love to do something in that little world. That's always been compelling to me. When I played Star Wars role playing game with my friends growing up, we would always set stories there because we loved the setting so much.
I'm right there with you. The Star Wars novel Brotherhood was like the best. I love that one. It was by Mike Chen. It's Anakin and Obi-Wan with a lot of Padme as well. But that whole prequel universe is like a dream. So I hope that
Mhm.
happens because I will be the first one in line to read it. Uh, okay, so before I let you go, I want to get back to Miraculous and just ask, you have additional stories coming. What do we have to look forward to, both from you and from the other people working on this project? The first volume, we got a pizza chase, we got stinky cologne or good cologne that turned into a stinky dive in the river. A lot of fun hijinks. So, without giving away anything you're not allowed to say, what do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, so you can expect more adventures from Ladybug and Cat Noir. You'll see more of the expanded cast, I think, as the stories kind of go on and on and on. But just more hijinks, more bad decisions from our heroes, and hopefully they don't, get rip each other's hair out by the end of it.
More bad
And then
decisions. Like,
for me, oh gosh, I'm writing for a company called Gearbox. They make the Borderlands games, and we have a big new game, Borderlands 4, coming out in the fall. So I'm very excited about that. And you can just find me online, and I've got new stuff coming out all the time.
awesome. Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate you sharing all of your insights and processes. This was great. Thank you.
No, of course, thank you for having me.
All right, everyone, have a good rest of your day.